Ready to do it?
Yeah.
So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Comic person here. Very excited to have my guest today, Phil Goldstein. Phil, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So Phil is a poet, editor, copywriter, journalist, and content marketer. His debut poetry collection, How to Bury a Boy at Sea, was published by Stillhouse Press in April 2022. In that collection, Phil is the architect of his own unburdening, offering a rare and unflinching glimpse into the effects of childhood sexual abuse from the male perspective. Equal parts fury and calm, Phil's poems contemplate family, faith, masculinity, and survival, delivering a powerful account of recovery through verse, from silence and shame to healing and rediscovered intimacy and agency. Phil, before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Sure. So I'm originally from a town called Suffern, New York, which is about half an hour northwest of New York City. And I currently live in Washington, D.C.
Okay, awesome. So let's just get into it. How did you get here such that we're talking on this podcast?
Sure. I grew up in a pretty normal middle class household, had a pretty normal childhood, but I was sexually abused by my older brother from the time that I was 10 to about 12 and a half. And I didn't tell anybody about that for close to 20 years.
Whoa.
And I started opening up about that after I went to therapy for the first time. It was actually before I was in therapy, when I was filling out an intake form for a therapist where it asked, have you ever suffered physical abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, sexual abuse? And I'd never been to therapy before. And so in my trauma brain, I was like, well, if I lie about it here and then it somehow like comes up in our session, because I was going to therapy ostensibly to talk about, sexual dysfunction I was having in my relationship with my then girlfriend. Like if it comes up and I've lied about it on this form, the therapist is going to be angry with me, which looking back now is like a crazy notion. Not crazy, but it's irrational. And so I checked yes. And that was the first time I'd ever kind of admitted to anything outside of my own mind that this had happened. And I brought it up in that first session with that therapist. And I said, this is something that happened to me, but I don't want to talk about it. It's not, why I'm here. And she was very respectful of that. She thanked me for, being comfortable enough to tell her, and trusting her with that information, but we didn't really talk about it. And then she left her practice a couple of months later. And when she did, she was basically like, look, I know we didn't talk about this, but in my experience, if you've been sexually abused as a child, it's bound to ripple out into your adult relationships, into every aspect of your life. And I would really urge you to tell your girlfriend and tell your parents. And it all kind of went from there. I did wind up telling.
All right, let me pause you here for a second,
Yeah.
because I want to, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
So you said it started at 10, went on for about two and a half years or so.
Mm-hmm.
So no one knew. You said
No
you
one.
didn't tell, no one suspected anything. You didn't say anything.
Nope.
How did you manage this?
I think that looking back, I really, physically, neurologically, dissociated. But I think that emotionally and in terms of presenting to the outside world, I really just compartmentalized and tried to excel. And I did. I was always really a good student, honor roll, AP courses, all that jazz, was involved in a lot of activities in high school, and just tried to kind of present as, this exceptional child. I think that looking back now, because I feared that if things did seem amiss in some way, then my parents and others would start kind of digging, and then they would
Mm-hmm.
find out. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that my operating theory was, you know, I need to play the role of the golden child, because my older brother was the trouble child. He was the one who was not doing well in school, and doing drugs and hanging out with the wrong crowd, et cetera, et cetera. And so I saw my role in my family structure as being the good kid, and so that's the role that I played.
So that's up until what, seventh grade or so.
Yeah.
Things stopped. How did this manifest as you got into high school and college and beyond?
um I think that for me, it really started to manifest after college. I had my first real relationship, my first sexual relationship with a woman, and you know, things were going great. And then all of a sudden, they weren't, in terms of sex. And I was having erectile dysfunction, and it really became a big issue in that relationship, led to the end of that relationship. And I honestly did not, at that point, consciously put two and two together. And that happened quite a bit, throughout my 20s, with other women. And looking back now, it's, very clear and obvious that the abuse, was having some kind of effect on me psychologically, in terms of, sex and
Mm-hmm.
expectations, and, um, you know, performance, etc. But that was really kind of the only obvious to me, not obvious, but obvious, to put it in a way, manifestation. But I was never somebody who, like, you know, um, did drugs, or, considered harming myself or anything like that, or, didn't have trouble in school, didn't have trouble getting a job and maintaining a job. I think that I was really compartmentalizing it
Mm-hmm.
up until, the moment at which I decided to talk about it out loud.
Mm-hmm. First of all, I mean, let me just say, I applaud your courage in uh, sh- talking about it initially. I mean, Jesus Christ. I mean, it takes a lot of freaking guts and courage and strength to do what you did, to talk about it, and then to write about it, which we'll get into, and then to come on this podcast. So I just want to say I really appreciate you doing that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Um, so as you were growing up, this was kind of compartmentalized in a sense. It was not something that you thought about or flashed on and just like shut it down or.
It's not that I was like, because I've met other survivors, who basically really repressed the memory and didn't have any memory of it until later on in life. It's not that, with me, it's not that I, like, didn't remember that it had happened. I just tried to really kind of shove it down and shove it aside and put it in this little box, um, and pretend like it didn't happen. Um, and so that's, just the way I operated. It's what I had to do to survive.
Now, during that time, post the abuse, what was your relationship like? Your brother, what was your relationship like with him?
Uh, we were never really that close. I mean, I think that we were really close, as close as kind of a brother who's 4.5 years older than you can be when I was a little kid. You know, but we were never really close because I just think that as we grew older, it became really clear kind of how different we were in terms of, you know, our academic and intellectual abilities and pursuits and personalities and things that we were interested in. And so, you know, we didn't have a particularly close relationship. You know,
Mm.
we were, it's not like we outwardly like hated with each other and fought with each other, but we just weren't, you know, super close. Like I have friends who have, you know, siblings and they're like thick as thieves and, you know, um, they they love each other and are, you know, really connected with each other on different levels. And that just wasn't really us.
Mhm. So it got to a point, you said 20 years later, which isn't really uncommon for when stuff like this comes out. But it you decided that you needed to say something. Walk us through how that realization came about for you.
I mean, I think that, you know, as I was explaining about my first experience with therapy, I think that I, you know, was kind of resisting pulling off the band-aid even then, even when I, you know, had admitted to a therapist that this had happened.
But you, excuse me, so you went in for something else,
Yeah, I
ostensibly.
mean, ostensibly, you know, I
Right.
went in to try to figure out, you know, what's going on with me sexually with my girlfriend. How can I fix this? How can I address this? And, you know, it wasn't, you know, certainly not to, you know, head on address the abuse and the trauma. Um, and I think that it wasn't until that therapist left her practice that I really came to the realization that, like, okay, you know, like you can keep on keeping on as you've been doing, and things probably won't get better, or you can decide to do something different. And it felt incredibly scary. Um, it was terrifying. I was absolutely not sure how to proceed, you know, not sure what was going to happen once my girlfriend, who's now my wife, and my parents and other people found out. But I kind of was like, at a certain point, you know, there's no turning back, and we'll just see what happens. And I mean, I'm trying to kind of foreground the absolute sense of fear and terror that I felt, and it's hard to, you know, go back there,
Mhm.
and just because so much has changed since then. But um, yeah, I was very uncertain and afraid.
So as you began this, um, can we call it a healing journey? Your
Sure.
this process of addressing what was going on.
Mhm.
Um, did you begin to see a different therapist? Did you start telling people, sharing this with others?
Yeah, it kind of unfolded uh, at first abruptly, and then kind of, you know, with a little stumble, and then all at once. So I mean, my girlfriend and I were at that point, you know, seeing a couples therapist, and the therapist who was leaving her practice was like, you should tell her, and then she can help you come up with some kind of a plan to tell Jenny, who's now my wife. And it kind of backfired. And because like I had spoken to the couples therapist once, you know, alone after a session, and like later on that week, maybe, or a week later, I was alone with Jenny, and she was asking me about that and was like, you know, what were you talking with her about? And I, you know, hadn't yet told her, obviously. And then I just kind of, you know, Jenny was pressing me, as I recall, about, what was going on. And, um, you know, it just kind of came out. And, um, she was really the first person who I told outside of that therapist. And, um, yeah, then I started telling family members who I felt close to, not my parents, I should say. I told cousins and aunts and uncles and those kind of folks. And then I told some friends. Um, and what was difficult was, at this time when I was telling people, and I had also, started seeing a new trauma focused therapist, was that my brother was getting married. And I was the best man at his wedding.
Oh my God.
And
And so up to this point had not said anything to him
not a
about
word.
this. Okay.
Yeah. And yeah, and then the wedding happens, and I do best man speech, and kind of extol how great a guy my brother is. And then after that, my parents and I got into this fight where, like, basically, like, uh, my brother had offered to, like, cover a small amount of the cost of his bachelor party, and I'd accepted that, and they got really upset with me that I had done that, and were like, the best man always pays for everything at the bachelor party, and we raised you to be better than this, and what are you doing? And they're being so upset with this. At the same time, I'm holding this knowledge in my head, that I'm gonna tell them about the abuse, and it was really hard to kind of um, square the circle there. And they were just really upset with me for months and months. And then eventually I told them in a letter that I sent to them, just because I felt like that would be the best way to get out what I needed to get out. I felt like if I did it kind of over the phone or over Zoom or whatever, that, it would just become too chaotic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I was really honestly very nervous that they were not going to believe me, just because, I had been reading about, survivors not being believed. And there was this ridiculous dispute about the bachelor party. And they did believe me. They were blindsided. They said that they had no idea, and were just really in shock. Um, but and they said, we're not going to sweep this under the rug. We're going to talk to your brother about it. We're probably going to get a therapist. They spoke to my therapist to try to kind of understand what was going on, and she talked to them in kind of broad terms about, CSA and trauma, and, what I'd been going through, and, you know, why kids don't tell, the vast majority of the time, and things like that. And then, they started seeing a therapist, and they wrote me a letter, and were basically like, we're not gonna, we're sorry that this happened to you, that this happened under our roof. Um, and we hope that you can find healing, but we're not going to triangle ourselves between you and your brother. And we feel like this is something that you should talk to him about directly. And at that point, I was not in a place where I felt like I wanted to, or could. And I had really wanted them to confront him, and they refused. And, that kind of set off. I mean, they eventually did, and he admitted it to them that he had done it, but it kind of set off a, you know, reaction and a pattern of behavior that was really harmful and not helpful. to me. And, we can get into it if you'd like, but, it's kind of led to the point where I'm estranged from my own parents, just because they reacted in a way that was deeply unempathetic and was, kind of like victim blamey of, well, you should have told us, and what do you want us to do about it now? And not really at all interested in talking through how and why this happened, why I felt like I couldn't tell them, all of that.
What helped you or continues to help you in moving through this, in working through this?
I mean, I think that for me, it's been a couple of things. It's been the support of my partner, who's absolutely wonderful and incredibly empathetic and patient and understanding. It's been therapy, which, I continue to do regularly.
And what, if I may, Phil, what about therapy specifically has helped you?
I think that it's, initially it was kind of going through the memories of what had happened, and coming to an understanding that I wasn't in control, that this wasn't my fault, and, kind of understanding the dynamics that were going on in my family to help me get a better understanding of how and why things happened. And yeah, just kind of giving myself, grace and the love and understanding that I didn't have as a child, and just, really kind of focusing in on the knowledge that I wasn't in control. This was something that was done to me. I wasn't in a position physically or emotionally where I could, consent to being abused, and that it wasn't my fault, and that I, you know, didn't tell anybody because I had to figure out a way to survive emotionally. And so I think that, kind of going through those beats, has been really helpful. It was helpful to be in therapy and have kind of an advocate for my feelings and what I was going through at a time when my parents weren't being supportive. So that was extremely helpful. And then the third thing is, creative writing and writing poetry. I always was a writer growing up. I wrote poetry when I was in middle school and high school, and it kind of fell off in college and in my 20s. But I really returned to it as a way to help me process the very kind of messy, complicated emotions that, surround this, of anger and grief and sadness and loss and happiness and growth and healing. And I think that were it not for the writing, I would not be, kind of where I am today in my journey.
I think that's a perfect segue into the book, How to Bury a Boy at Sea. How did the book come about?
So when I started the trauma therapy, this was back in spring of 2018, my therapist, encouraged me to write because I had told her, that I was a writer. And I started writing some poems. And after I'd had about, half a dozen to a dozen, Jenny was saying, you should write some more, maybe like consider writing enough to be a book. Um, you know, and maybe it could help people. And I really kind of ran with that and wrote a lot, and had a friend of mine from college who's a wonderful poet herself, fantastic poet, Rachel Mennes, edited the first manuscript for me, and then I submitted it to a bunch of presses and contests, and it eventually got picked up by a great press called Stillhouse, and that was like kind of at the very beginning of the pandemic, and then spent the next year and a half really kind of revising and writing new poems and different kinds of poems that the editors there really encouraged me to write. And then the book came out in April of this year.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Have you been in contact with your brother?
Not directly, no. He sent me a letter about, 6 to 7 months after I first told my parents. I guess it was his attempt to apologize. To me, it didn't really come off as a very sincere apology. It was very kind of like, I was a messed up kid. I didn't know that what I was doing was wrong. Hope that we can bury the hatchet, basically. And I don't know. I've always found it kind of wild to think that, like, because at the time the abuse ended, he was 17. I just find it wild to think that a 17-year-old doesn't know that what they're doing is wrong. And didn't really kind of ask me how I was doing, what he could do to help me, and I didn't accept it. And I think my parents got really upset with that. And then he's, sent me a couple of other missives that have gotten progressively more, angry and threatening, because, I think that he very much wanted me to absolve him and let him off the hook and then just kind of move on. And I didn't want to do that.
So a couple of questions there. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I think the very fact of being a male and having this experience and coming forward, how do you sit with that? I mean, like I said, I think it takes a lot of courage. I mean, it took me, I was bullied as a kid. It took me a long time to be able to talk about that. And what are your thoughts on being a male and having gone through this and sharing this and being open and writing about it?
I mean, it was really difficult. I think that things are starting to change, thankfully, but I still think that there's a great deal of stigma around male disclosure of sexual assault or sexual abuse. Just these really kind of harmful societal notions that, if this is something that's happened to you, you're not a real man, or why didn't you fight back, or, are you gay because this happened to you, and all that kind of, BS, and I think that it's been really heartening to do kind of group therapy with other male survivors, which I did a few years ago, and to hear from and talk with other men who are survivors, and a couple of whom have reached out to me following the publication of the book, to tell me that they really appreciated the fact that I had written this book. And I'm obviously not the first guy to write a book, or even write a book of poetry that deals with abuse. I certainly hope I'm not the last. But I think that the more that we can normalize discussions, among men, by men, the less power that stigma will hold. And it's something that is going to take time. I think, like I said, I think it's getting better. I think the documentary, Leaving Neverland, about Wade Robson and James Safechuck was really important for me and spurring me to kind of post publicly, on social media about what had happened.
That was about Michael Jackson, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Those guys are fantastic. Hoping to connect with them at some point. So I think that things are starting to open up and get, more welcoming and accepting and understanding of men. And this is not to sort of diminish in any way, the challenges that, women face and have faced, in dealing with sexual assault and sexual abuse, because, statistically, there are many more girls who are sexually abused than boys. But I do think that in our culture, it is more normal to accept and hear stories like this from girls and women. And I'm hoping that starts to change, around men and boys.
Is there a pressure on you, or do you feel a pressure to forgive your brother?
I think that certainly from my parents, that was there. I think that they wanted me to forgive him, and then, everybody would hug and shake hands and move on. I think that they wanted it to be over as quickly as possible. There are some other family members that I think, really wanted me to forgive him. But I think that, most people in my life understood, as I do, that there's a big difference between someone apologizing to you or offering an apology and you accepting that apology or you forgiving them. They're just different things. And just because somebody apologizes to you doesn't mean that you have to accept the apology or forgive them. It's, do you feel like the apology was genuine? Do you want to forgive them? Do you want to have a relationship with them? And like I said, my relationship with my brother was never particularly close. So I didn't really feel like I needed to sort of go above and beyond to salvage a relationship with him, because there wasn't a very strong relationship to speak of.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought to me, because sometimes you hear of people who've had their kids, killed by someone, and the parents go into the prison and they end up talking to the killer and forgiving them. Is it necessary for you to, I guess, how do you work through that relationship with your brother? Because I would imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, I would imagine there's got to be some strong feelings there, some anger. How do you hold that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for a long time, I didn't allow myself to feel anger. And, I think that that's pretty common for people who've been abused, you know, to see anger as not justified or something to avoid. And I certainly felt very angry at times, especially in the first year or two after I disclosed, in part because, I think that it was anger that I probably should have felt more concentratedly towards my brother, that I was directing maybe at my parents, because I felt like they were either taking his side or were not really kind of rushing to my side. I felt like I'm the one who's been harmed. You should be in my corner or try to
Mhm.
empathize with me and see things from my point of view. And I think that they were like, well, you know, you're both our sons, and so we're trying to, help both of you. And I think that that angered me, because it's like, well, but what did I do? I'm
Right.
the one who was abused. Um, so, I think that in the time since then, I've tried to work a lot on forgiving mostly myself for not speaking up when I was younger, for, you know, feeling my feelings, and for responding the way that I did and that I have. I don't have any real regrets about, you know, basically finally putting my feelings and my emotions first, for the first time in a long time.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that the anger is kind of dissipated a lot over time. Um, and I try to kind of focus on, helping other people, and um, kind of thinking about all the positive things that are going on in my life.
Awesome. All right, Phil, as we kind of wind down here, where can the book be purchased? How to Bury a Boy at Sea.
Sure, you can either go to my website, which is philagoldstein.com. That's PhilaGoldstein.com, or you can get it from my publisher, Stillhouse Press, or basically anywhere books are sold, Amazon, bookshop.org. Just search for the title, How to Bury a Boy at Sea.
Okay. We'll also have this linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Phil, sir, thank you so much for coming on here. Appreciate your courage, and it's an inspiration to us all, seriously.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me on. It was great to talk with you.
Awesome. All right, man. Be well. Take care.
You too.
Thank you.